So the sibilance in this stanza also suggests a kind of smooth action and skill of the father, and this poem very much emphasises the skill of the father, and I think it ties in with the interpretation of the word follower there, that the son really looks up to and admires his father, and there's a real sense of that as he watches him work the land, that this is a son who is really appreciating all of that skill and expertise that the father has. If we have a look here at the way in which the father controls the horses, he can do that just by clicking his tongue, and at that click the horse is strained, and I think that verb really emphasises the skill that he has and the control that he has over this situation. And again we have another declarative sentence here suggesting the respect and awe that the son has. This again, it's very specific to Heaney's upbringing and watching his father work as a child and work the land, so we get a lot of language here which is very specific to working the land and the things that were involved at the time. So the sod is the earth, and as the earth is ploughed it rolls over without a single crack appearing in the earth, and the horses are controlled with a single pluck. And I think both of these descriptions again emphasise the incredible skill of the father and how adept he was at controlling both the land and this body of horses. So the team turned round and his eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. So again we get the sense that the father is very commanding and authoritative. The poetic voice is really just watching him do all of this. So the poetic voice, or Heaney, is very much in a passive position, watching the father work the land as opposed to working the land with him. And I think that creates this initial sense of distance between the father and son here, that Heaney is really a child watching this father who is this incredible, mythological, experienced, skilled person, and he's just kind of a passive observer. And here we get this juxtaposition between the father and the son. I stumbled in his hobnailed wake. So you get a real sense of him being kind of inadequate or less skilled. In his wake links to what we've said about the title already, of the fact that perhaps he felt like he was in the father's shadow, or somehow just following behind him rather than treading his own path. And these verbs, stumbled and fell, suggest this kind of inferiority or weakness in the son, and perhaps the son just isn't meant for this kind of way of life. And this way of life would have been dying out at the time as well, with the invention of machinery and importing food and whatnot from other countries. This is very much work associated with the older generation rather than the new generation. So again, generational differences. The dipping and rising to his plod, also reflects the rhythm of the poem, kind of undulating like the earth, showing a connection between the man and the land, which emphasises the power of the father in the child's eyes. So the father's tread, the father's step, is actually much like the movement of the earth underneath him. So the father's walk is kind of reflected by the earth. This I wanted to, this creates a sense of regret or failure or longing perhaps in the son. He wanted to follow in the father's footsteps, but he's not able to. All I ever did was follow. So in his broad shadow, the enjambment between those lines emphasises really the difference between the son who is following and the broad shadow who is the father, but also the distance between what the father's perhaps expectations are, or what the son's expectations are, and what the reality is. The fact that all he ever did was follow, he's not able to do the rest. So it's both a literal and metaphorical being in the father's shadow there. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping. A lot of dehumanising animalistic imagery here. I feel like the son is really criticising himself and being quite negative towards himself, that he's not able to live up to these things. But that was him in the past, that's him as a child, but today. And that caesura creates now a movement from the child narrator into what he is now as an adult. But today it's my father who keeps stumbling. And this is really a reminder of ageing, the ageing process. I'm just going to shut the door. The ageing process and how that actually changes our relationships with our parents, because quite often as our parents grow older and become perhaps elderly, it's the children who start to look after them. And I think this is really, really sad kind of reminder of that ageing process and the role reversal that that creates. So it's the father now who is stumbling behind me and will not go away. Now the ending of this poem seems very abrupt and quite ambiguous, and I think there's a real sense of guilt here, that he cannot live up to the father's example or his expectations perhaps. This idea of not having fulfilled what the father would have wanted will not go away. Seamus Heaney went on to university and became a poet, which is very, very different to working the land and doing kind of physical work. So maybe this relates to his own sense of having let his father down, that sense of guilt will not go away. Or perhaps he's kind of irritated by the father now. The father won't go away, the father won't stop trailing behind me. But either way, there's a sense that the father and the son are very deeply tied to one another, that there's a kind of unbreakable bond between them, which is emphasised by the enjambment and the cyclical nature of life, which is very poignant. So it's cyclical, not just in terms of what happens in the poem, but in terms of somebody following behind somebody else and stumbling. It's almost like there's an inevitability to this child growing up and moving on, and then the parent ageing and becoming the child themselves and following behind the grown-up child. So I really think this is a very poignant, sad poem about perhaps expectations which haven't been met, both in terms of your parents' expectations and your own expectations. But it's also a very respectful, admirational poem that doesn't devalue what's gone before, but also acknowledges that we must move forward and we must constantly go forward and not be followers as children and actually carve our own path.